the benefit plan will cover 3 sessions, and that's barely enough to get started. Right? So it'd be great if we could push some type of mental health support program for emergency workers that didn't cost us anything. Right? That would be, and I know that's something that you guys are working on. So anything I can do to help support you guys at that, that's great.
Yeah.
So that's something that would be very, very supportive for us. I know a lot of people struggle with that because they don't get the help that they need because they can't afford it. Right?
You're listening to The Shift Show, where we use psychological insight to unravel the craziness of life for you. You growth mindset person, you. Tune in every other Thursday to hear some wacky psychologists demystify what exactly is happening in that weird organ that lives inside your skull. And for this especially delicious podcast experience, we can thank our friends at Shift Psych, the people who deliver a results-driven and innovative approach in therapy land. Throughout the podcast, we'll throw down some serious psych gems, but these are certainly not a replacement for treatment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So please seek one out if you need help. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Shift Show. My name is Shaleen Premji, and I work behind the scenes here at Shift on things like the website, community initiatives, and even this podcast. So you may even recognize my voice. I'm going to be your host for this episode, and today we're talking about a really important topic that really isn't talked about enough. There are individuals out there who are working hard every day and in the process experiencing extremely traumatic events, which can be really, really hard to process. So we're talking about first responders, paramedics, firefighters, police officers, everyone who's out there doing a really difficult job, and they often come home and end up replaying the events that they've seen over and over in their mind. We want to talk about how this impacts them, what we as people who aren't first responders need to understand about it, and most importantly, the support or potentially lack thereof that these individuals have to deal with these traumatic events. Our guest today is someone who has experienced all of this firsthand over a period of almost 20 years. That's a hugely impactful amount of time. He's a full-time paramedic and firefighter here in Alberta, and he's found a really unique and beautiful way to express some of the things that he experiences on the job. So we're going to talk about all of that, and we have with us here Daniel Sundahl. Welcome, Daniel. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Shalene. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll get into the creative side of things a little bit later. But how did you find yourself in the role of a first responder, of a paramedic and firefighter?
Well, I became a paramedic in 2003 and an EMT back in 1996. And I kind of had the first idea to become an emergency worker while working as a dive master in the Cayman Islands. And part of our training was rescue diving. And we were doing our CPR and how to rescue people from the water. And I really, really enjoyed that type of training and education. And one day on my way home from work, I saw this guy get hit by this giant dump truck. And I got so excited, which is weird. But I got all excited. I pulled over my car and ran up to this guy. I'm like, oh, I have basic first aid essentially at that point. But I thought, I'm really going to help this guy. I was excited that I had the training to maybe help him.
Right.
But this guy was folded in half and his foot was by his face.
Oh, my God.
And he was gurgling and I didn't know what to do. But I was so excited to see that, which is
a little odd.
Kind of messed up, right? And then the paramedics showed up and they unfolded this guy and took him to the hospital. But, that kind of gave me the first idea of, maybe I'm weird enough to maybe be a paramedic. And that's kind of where it first entered my mind.
Okay.
And then several years later, I became a paramedic.
Cool. Yeah. So because you were a teacher before all of this, right?
It's kind of a weird timeline. I became I became an EMT, or primary care paramedic, as we call them here in Canada, in 1996. And then I became an English teacher and then worked in English as a second language.
Right.
Then I traveled around the world teaching English for almost 5 or 6 years doing that. And then I came back to Canada and then finished my training, become a paramedic. And then I've been doing that ever since 2003.
Yeah. It's kind of funny how you end up in a certain career. Like you don't necessarily plan for it. It just kind of happens.
Yeah, it just kind of happens. I never thought that this was something I'd be doing.
Yeah. And obviously like you've been in it for almost 20 years. So
yeah,
you enjoy it.
Yes.
Yes. No.
Yeah, I guess I could still say I do enjoy it. Yeah, it's really an amazing career, and I'll just say it has not disappointed me.
Right.
Let's say that.
Yeah. And like we said, 20 years is a long time to be in a career like this. What's the average amount of time that people usually stick around in this career?
I think it really depends on where you work, the call volume, your work environment. But when I got into it, at the time, the average career span of a paramedic was about 7 years.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's really changed that much, especially for the busier services. I think for me, because I work for an integrated service, I'm a firefighter as well. So we do 24-hour shifts. So I do 24 hours on the ambulance. Then I'm off for a day, off for 24 hours. Then I'm 24 hours on the fire truck. Then I'm off for 5 days. So the variety is great. And I'm only on that ambulance 1 day every 8, even though it's a 24-hour shift. So I think that is a big reason why, I've lasted this long.
Yeah. Is that something that's common for people to switch between two different things, or are people usually either a paramedic or a firefighter or a police officer?
Yeah, it really varies. Again, so here in Alberta, kind of all the surrounding cities of Edmonton, we're all integrated. So like St. Albert and Stony Plain and, Leduc where I work, in Sherwood Park. So we all we're integrated. So we do both. We're firefighters and paramedics. But in the city, you're either a paramedic or a firefighter. But having said that, all firefighters in the city for Edmonton Fire, they all respond to medical calls as well. So they also do, any firefighter, no matter where you are, a large percentage of the calls that you attend on are medical.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So this episode is all about trauma and PTSD in first responders, right? So, I think we know the answer to this, but how frequent is trauma and PTSD in this field? And we're talking about vicarious trauma as well. So the idea that it might not necessarily happen to somebody directly, but they might witness a colleague or somebody that they're trying to help experience something traumatic. So does this happen to a handful of people, half, everyone? What are we looking at here?
Well, I think it depends on who you are and what studies you read and who you listen to.
Right.
And it's a very difficult thing to measure. Right. So I can only speak on my experiences and what I've been told from my peers. But I think the consensus is that for first responders, we're 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with a significant, mental disorder than the general public.
Yeah.
But even that, I don't think is super accurate because it's hard to measure. You might talk with some emergency workers and they'll say, yeah, if you're going to get in this job, you're going to get PTSD 100%, which I don't agree with. Everyone's resiliency levels are different. Everyone's experiences are different. Everyone's going to react differently.
Right.
And because of that, it is harder to measure. Yeah. But I think we are definitely more susceptible to mental trauma for many different reasons than the general public.
And like you said, it's different for everybody. So everybody who's in the field probably also has different triggers, right? Something that might be hard for somebody to see might not be so hard for somebody else. And so it varies that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on your past. Like, for example, if me and my partner went to a car accident that involved children, if the children were the same age as my partner's kids, well, that's going to affect them differently than me if I don't have kids that age. Or, if you had a father that died or a mother or a family member that died in a specific way and you go to that call with that same scenario, well, then that's going to affect you a lot differently then, which may seem that it wouldn't affect the normal person, but a lot of us don't know. We don't know what's in our closets, right? We don't know what trauma people are carrying. So it is different for everybody.
Yeah. And I think it also depends on how you've kind of processed your past traumas. Like even in the life that you had before you were a first responder, like we said, there are all these types of things that impact us. And if we haven't necessarily had the time or space or energy to deal with them, they get kind of locked away. And then that door unlocks when you see something similar.
Yeah. And I think most people think when we talk about trauma, especially for emergency workers, we're thinking of the calls that we go on, or like the traumatic stressors of the calls that we go to. However, many studies are coming out that the source of a large percentage of our trauma is non-traumatic stressors.
Okay.
So like work environments, unsupportive family or supervisors, overtime, forced overtime, low pay,
Right.
all of that type of controllable stressors have a very large impact. And some studies say that is actually a more accurate predictor of long-term disability than the actual trauma that we expect to see.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of studies coming out, and it's very exciting. And I try to keep up on that, and I try to read as much as I can, because I think we could be doing a lot better than we are in my industry.
For sure, yeah. And we're going to talk about all that support or lack thereof in a little bit, because that's definitely something we need to understand and address too. But for now, so there are different ways that people might deal with this trauma, right? And sometimes even PTSD. And we can talk about that as well, but let's talk about your art a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about it, how you got into it, and what it means to you?
Sure. Yeah. So my artwork, it's all photo based. So I take a picture and then I digitally draw and paint on top of that photograph.
Okay.
And that style of photography I've been doing for a long time, with landscapes and pictures of my dogs and that type of stuff. But once I was diagnosed with PTSD, and through my therapy, my psychologist was talking about hobbies that I've had and what I can do as a form of treatment. And I mentioned the photography, and we kind of discussed thinking, well, maybe we can somehow purge these emotions I'm having through my artwork, through my photography. So that's what I did. It doesn't seem like a very helpful thing to do because you're right into it, but that's what I started doing. So I thought of, a specific memory or call that I have. I staged it. I photographed it.
Okay.
And over a week, I drew and painted digitally on top of that photograph, but trying to recreate what I felt more so than what I saw. And that's why a lot of my artwork has like weird stuff in it, like demons and devils and ghosts and all this weird stuff. But I use demons to represent trauma and angels to represent recovery. And I found that was really cathartic for me. So it started off, I describe it as a organic, uninvited entity that enters my memory uninvited. That's how these traumas manifest for me and many others, I think. And when I create the artwork, it's like I capture them into this picture that I can see. So it no longer, after I do the artwork of that specific emotion, it no longer pops into my head uninvited, because now over that week I've processed it and captured it into this one picture, which I can control. So for me, it's very therapeutic. And a lot of the artwork that I do really is still personal for me. So when I do create it, I have to be authentic for that. So I don't create it thinking, what are people going to like? Is this going to shock people? Is this going to be, are people going to buy this? I don't think of that. I think this has to represent how I'm feeling, and it needs to be authentic to this process. And I think because of that, that's why my artwork is so popular amongst my peers, because they recognize how real it is.
Yeah, that's just such an amazing way to express and process what you've seen. And I guess some of these scenes that you kind of recreate to take a picture and then do your painting on top of that, you probably can see some of these things in your mind at the time. Like when you're on that scene, you can maybe, do you see something that's like not actually there, in the sense that this feels like a really negative situation and I'm starting to feel a certain type of way? Like you can picture that demon or that ghost or whatever there, and then you kind of bring it to life afterwards, in a sense of taking the power away from it in a way, right? Like you're putting it on the paper, and you said that doesn't come up in your mind anymore. So do you see those things after the event, or do you see them kind of while you're there?
During the photo session, I don't see anything. However, during that photo session, and I know that I can speak on behalf of many of my peers, when we think about a specific event, we remember every detail, right? So when we're setting up the photo session, I remember where my IVs were. I remember what medications I used. I remember what was on the monitor. I remember where I threw the boxes. I remember what garbage was on the floor. I remember where the trauma was. I remember where the blood was. I remember every minor detail, no matter how long ago that call was. So we think of that when we set it up. So when we set up the photo session, that's what we're going through. We're making it as accurate as we can. So the emotional part doesn't really come in for me at that time, but it certainly does when I'm working on it afterward.
Right.
So that's when all the emotions come in, and that's when I try to recreate, things that I felt. So yeah, it's a very emotional process for me, and it comes through in my artwork, I think.
Oh, absolutely. So for our listeners out there, we know you can't see Dan's art right now, but he has created these wonderful art books. I think you said you have 3 of them.
I have 3 of them, yeah.
Okay. So you can see Daniel's art on his website at dansunphotos.com, as well as your social medias, which we'll put in the description for the podcast. But for everyone out there, Daniel's photos are very, very kind of thought and emotion provoking, I guess you could say. A lot of attention to detail. Sometimes you open the book and you just don't know what you're going to see, right? You flip and you might see an angel, or you might see like a child who with a smile on their face, or then you might open it up and see, like this devil guy with a ski mask and a gun, and you just don't know what you're going to get. And there's so many different emotions you very clearly process through all of this, that I think that is just such a great way for people to learn and understand what first responders go through. And one of the cool things that you do in your books is you have a little bit of a blurb of what you were trying to create in this photo. And then you have some of the responses that people have given to that specific photo. And I love how you chose some of those, because some of them are not necessarily fully experiencing the same thing. They maybe have felt something different. So you get really like a variety of experiences through some of these images. Do you have any favorites, or ones that I don't know if favorite is the right word, but any that really come to mind that you really have connected with, or anything like that?
Yeah, there's several. And like I said, I try to be as authentic as I can. So the process is I have this emotion that invades my consciousness uninvited, which happens over years. And I think about that, and I think, how am I going to capture that complex emotion in one picture? And then that picture will pop into my head. And the more I can create that image in my head to a visual image, the more authentic to the process is for that. The easier that I can match that up would be considered my favorite image. It's hard to describe. So I'm fumbling for words, because it's a really hard concept to verbalize. But yeah, I have several of them. Probably my favorite one is also the darkest image and the most emotional one I've ever done. And it's in my 3rd book. Okay. And it's called The Demon Eats the Ambulance Driver. So it's one of my favorite artists is Francisco Goya, a Spanish artist. And he was really a interesting guy. And he was the portrait painter for royalty of the time. And that's kind of what he did. But he kind of had a bit of a dark side too, which he expressed in his artwork. And he did these dark paintings, and which he never intended anyone to see. But that's how he, I assume, processed his emotions. At the time, there was a lot of war in Spain, and he used his artwork to express his emotions. So his dark paintings, there's one called Saturn Eats His Sons, and it's this giant monster eating this person. And, I really like the emotion and what that picture represents. So I kind of borrowed on that to make The Demon Eats the Ambulance Driver. And for paramedics, ambulance driver is a very derogatory term, and I know that. Yeah. But it's a very graphic picture. It's this giant demon that's biting the head off of a paramedic. Right? It's when people see it, they're very disturbed by seeing it. But the reason I called it the ambulance driver is because the paramedic in that picture is no longer a paramedic. That image represents the moment of taking your life. That represents suicide. So when and again, I can mostly speak of my own experiences. But one thing I didn't realize when I started creating this artwork is that so many of my peers would connect to it through their own experiences. So I've received a lot of feedback on my artwork from my peers from around the world. And in that picture in particular, it's the moment of surrendering yourself, of just saying, look, I don't want to feel anything anymore. I'm exhausted. I can't defend myself against this constant barrage of pressure and just feeling horrible all the time. And it's just kind of the feeling of, okay, I want to get off this ride because I can't take it anymore. And that's what that picture represents. So the ambulance driver in that picture is literally being consumed. He's being eaten by his demons. So people that have been in that space where they are hours, minutes, seconds away from taking their life, that picture really, really connects with them, because that's them. This is them giving in or surrendering. I don't want to say giving in. Surrendering yourself is a better way to put it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a really emotional picture for me and lots of other people that have been in it. When I do presentations on post-traumatic growth, and when I talk about this picture, I always follow it up with another picture called Finding Peace, which is the cover of my second book. So it's an angel standing next to a paramedic, and they're forehead to forehead. And in the background, you can't really see it clearly, but in the background, the devil or the demon is there and he's screaming. And the reason he's screaming is because the paramedic is getting help. So the paramedic has decided that no, he's not going to be consumed by his trauma. He's going to get the help that he needs. So I always follow up that first one, because that first one's very heavy. The demon is the ambulance driver is a very heavy picture, but it is the most authentic picture that I have. But I want people to know that it doesn't have to be that way. It could be like Finding Peace, where that paramedic is getting the help that he needs. So I always follow it up that way. But probably those two are my most favorite pictures, because they have the most meaning for me personally. And plus, they're the most authentic to me trying to reproduce that complex emotion in an image.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. Mm-hmm. That is definitely one of the images that really stuck out to me as I went through your book. And I think it's really great that you try to be as authentic as you can, not really worrying or thinking about like how will people respond to this, because it's your experience and it's probably very many other people's experience too. And
I received a lot of negative feedback from that picture.
Yeah.
Which I understand. I get it. My mom doesn't understand my artwork. I love my mom, but she's, when I did that one, she sent me a message, goes, Dan, why is your picture so gross? Why is it so nasty? Right? She just doesn't understand it, which is fine. My wife doesn't. My wife hates that picture, which I understand, because it's not comfortable to look at. But for those of us that have been on that precipice of ending our own lives, that is a really powerful image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To look
and
at.
Sometimes the things that are uncomfortable are the things that we need to see the most, right? So again, for everyone listening, I hope you do go and take a look at this image and Daniel's other images as well. But really scary looking kind of demon here. There's a lot of blood. And something that sticks out to me is the individual doesn't have his arms. They're just down by his side, right?
He's not defending himself.
Yeah, he's not doing anything else at this point. He's kind of done at this point. So very visceral, and I think important to see. Do you mind if I read some of these responses that you've gotten?
Yeah. So in the art book, when I create the images, I always have a narrative with them. Mm-hmm. So the reason I wanted to create the books is most people see my artwork on their phones. So on these small things. So the art books are big. They're hardcover coffee table books and proper color, nice paper. So I want people to look at the picture and then read the narrative and then read what their peers are looking. So the books are really targeted for my peers, for fellow emergency workers. But I want them to feel when they go through the book and look at the image, read my narrative, read what other people have said, how they've connected to it, so that they get the feeling that they're not alone, that they're connected with us,
right?
Which is very, very healing.
Yeah. So is it okay if I read some of these responses?
Yeah.
Okay. So one individual here says, I think this is the most intense painting you have ever done, and it resonates the most with me. Somebody else says, absolutely bang on. If we don't admit that we all struggle, and if we don't battle back our demons, they will 100% eat our souls and consume us. And one other individual says, sometimes the darkest images are the ones that shed the most light. So, like we said, uncomfortable to see sometimes, and especially when you first open up to this page. But I really appreciated your narratives alongside the images to really understand, especially as somebody who's not a first responder, and I don't really have anyone in my life who is a first responder that I'm close to necessarily. So it's really eye-opening, and I really appreciate your openness and your narratives along with the photos as well.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah. So you had mentioned that you like to follow up some of those heavier images with something a little bit more positive or with more light. And I'm glad you said that, because one of my favorite images that I saw in your third art book here is called post-traumatic growth. I stared at it for quite a little while because it's really wonderful. It shows a phoenix coming out of somebody who looks like a very tired paramedic, right? So he is sitting he's sitting down, and his legs are spread out a little bit, and his elbows rest on his legs, and then he holds what seems to be his heavy head in his hands, right? And you have a phoenix kind of seamlessly coming out from him. And I love what you said about maybe we don't necessarily want to go back to our original selves, but maybe we want to become even better in our healing, in our growth. So that was a really, really nice, touching image to follow up to the previous one.
Yeah.
So really like that one.
Yeah, I think for post-traumatic growth, it's something that a lot of us aren't familiar with. And sometimes, in my experiences, when I speak with my peers, we really identify with our trauma. So we are our trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we start to forget who we were before our trauma. So when I do my sessions and I speak, the main topic is about post-traumatic growth. So if you were unfortunate enough to receive some type of mental trauma because of the experiences that you've had, and this isn't only for emergency workers, there's even a larger population of people that have experienced some type of trauma. But if you go through that work, you essentially reconfigure your brain and change that brain chemistry and do the work to get better. There's many examples of you coming out the other end better than what you were before your trauma. And there's many examples of that. There's many religions that believe there's no growth without trauma. Mm-hmm. And it's something I want to share with my peers, where it's like, hey, you've already done the trauma part. There's a silver lining around this gray cloud. Take that trauma and flip it and become this phoenix. Do the work, and you can become something bigger and better than you were before. And I'm a living example of that. I'm doing things that I never would have done before my trauma, because of that trauma that I experienced and the work that I've done to get better. So it's a very positive example. And we do when conferences were still a thing, we would do a conference every year where I would invite my peers through my travels that I have recognized this post-traumatic growth in them, and have them come and talk about their experiences of their post-traumatic growth. And these are, paramedics that were involved in the Las Vegas shooting, firefighters involved in 9/11, some first responders that were involved in some pretty memorable and ginormous events. And these people are thriving because of those events and the work that they're going through. So I invite them, we do a conference, they share their experiences, so that other people that may be deep in their trauma or contemplating taking their life because they don't know what else to do, that they can look at us and realize that, hey, there's nothing special about me. There's nothing special about these other paramedics and emergency workers that have experienced this post-traumatic growth. But the difference is that they made that decision to get the treatment and get better. And the result was that now they're identifying with something. They're not identifying with their trauma. They're not even identifying with who they were before their trauma. They're identifying with this new being that they've become, which is really exciting and really, really wonderful. And for those of us that have done the hard work of experiencing that trauma, some of us don't realize that, hey, that you could use that to your advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's, on one hand, you're sharing really traumatic events and feelings and experiences with your colleagues and your peers, which I think they need to see. But also, on the other hand, what you've been able to do with your trauma, like you said, kind of turn it around, focus on that Phoenix side of it and come out on the other side is something that I'm sure many of them need to hear just as much. So I think those conferences are probably really helpful and something that a lot of people probably need to hear. So it's great to know that there are so many of you who are taking all of these terrible things that have happened in your careers and lives and trying your best to turn it into something positive that a lot of people, I mean, I'm sure you've saved lives doing things like this, right? You save lives at work and you save lives in this way.
Yeah.
So
And that's, this is my own therapy really to create the R work, but I definitely get more satisfaction and purpose from doing the R work because people have sent me messages saying, Daniel, I was in my bedroom with a gun in my hand, flipping through my Instagram before I ended my life, and your pictures come up. And it convinced me to get help. Like that blows my mind. And that happens often. I get these messages and that, there's no better reward for any artist to hear how people react to the artwork that you're doing. And I think the reason it is that way is because I am so authentic in what I create.
Yeah.
Even though it is very personal to me, but I'm not unique in the way I'm feeling. There's many of us that are like that. But again, my message is to get help. Often when we're deep in our trauma, our brain chemistry changes and we don't realize the trouble that we're in. So sometimes we need help. Someone needs to reach in and pull them out. And maybe it's just my image is what kind of snaps things where, hey, this guy reached inside my brain and my mind, illustrated my deepest secrets, and 500 other people commented on it and connected to it. Hey, maybe I'm not alone in how I'm feeling. Maybe this isn't as weird as I think it is. If these guys got better, maybe I can too, right? And it encourages them to at least get assessed, even if you do an online assessment where nobody knows. And from there, if you have the resources and if you're able to get a proper assessment done, and then get the treatment and go on that path of recovery.
Yeah, and you do have quite a global kind of following, and people are aware of you in all corners of the world. I know you've done a lot of traveling in different countries, and you represent some pieces in your art books from different experiences across different countries. So I know you have the United States in there, Australia, and a few other countries. But I guess that's kind of how you've found yourself with such a large global following, is all these efforts that you make to travel and meet people and make impacts in different parts of the world.
Yeah, like I said, when I first started creating the artwork, I was scared to share it with people. I didn't think my peers would really connect with them. The first ones that I didn't share for the longest time because it's showing emergency workers in a vulnerable state. They're showing them being, sad or traumatized, and we're supposed to be these infallible superheroes. So when I created the artwork, I really didn't expect them to connect with my peers that way, which is okay. That's not why I was creating it. I was doing it for myself. But when I started to share them, that's when my entire world changed. So that's when I started getting invited to exhibit my artwork in Finland and England, Guatemala. So yeah, I've traveled all through the States and all through Canada. So now I travel, all over the world exhibiting my artwork, doing my presentation. And when I do travel, I sit down with my peers. I ask, what their work is like, and what mental health supports they have. And I kind of get inside their heads a little bit. And then we do photo sessions with them, which and they're always the same no matter where I go, where the emotions and the feelings are the same for emergency workers in my experience. So it's easy for me to recreate images for them because often their experiences are my own as well.
Right. Yeah. I remember one of the ones that you have in here. I don't remember the name of it, but it has to do with the shark bite.
Oh yeah, that was in Australia. That was in Melbourne. Yeah.
Yeah. So something that wouldn't necessarily be something you have to worry about here, or something that you get called to, but the way that it's responded to, or maybe some of the things that they experience similar to what you do, right? So all over the world, every country, I guess, has its own emergencies that it needs to respond to that we would never think of here. But like you said, the experiences and feelings, a lot of those are the same. Yeah.
And I really want to represent my profession in general. And that's not only for paramedics and firefighters, it's nurses, it's dispatchers, it's police, it's, there's many people that I consider in my first responder family. And I
Right.
want to promote our profession as a whole in a positive way. And I want to represent everybody so that they get the recognition that they deserve. So that's really kind of my focus of my artwork and DanSun as a whole.
Yeah, and I appreciate your openness to having others use your art in a really positive and educational way. We here at Shift actually use some of these pieces in a presentation that we've released on first responder trauma and PTSD. So some of the things to look for, the signs and symptoms, and how to process that. So thank you, Daniel, for your involvement with that project. Our psychologist, Samantha Greenwood, helped us with that one. So thank you, Sam. It's available on our website and social media as well. And hopefully some people will find that useful. And on the note kind of recognizing some of these signs and symptoms in first responders, one of the things that you mentioned in your book is what you've come to call the false okay. And that stuck with me a little bit. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the false okay. I've done probably 2 or 3 different images about that. And because there's so much shame and guilt associated with mental traumas for emergency workers, I think for everyone in general, maybe. Again, I can only talk about my own experiences and what I've heard from my peers, is we really don't want to share them. We don't want to talk to people about them. We're a bit embarrassed about it. And a part of that is, I think, from the chemistry change that happens in our brains. But often we'll hear of an emergency worker who takes their life, and everyone is so shocked and surprised. We didn't know that they were suffering. Nobody knew, nobody had any idea. And sometimes some of these people are, they're part of the peer support teams. And so there really is a shock that when we hear that these people are taking their lives. So, but I completely understand that. I'm not shocked at all, because we get so good at hiding our trauma from people. We can go to work, be effective emergency workers, while having our end of life plan, right? So it's really scary when you think about it, that you can be a good husband, you can be a good father, you can be a good coworker, you can be a good friend, but it's all a false okay. So everything, you can go through your whole life, everything is normal, and then all of a sudden they find you whatever. Many of us take our lives in our place of work or in a uniform, and our uniform away from work. And that's a pretty clear message. And everyone, often they're surprised, because we're so good at hiding what we're feeling, because we don't want to share with anybody. There's shame, there's guilt. And that's why I do my artwork. That's why I'm so open about it. That's why I speak at conferences and share my own experiences. For me personally, I had a suicide plan, and my plan, I was going to drive my car in front of a big truck. And I always wanted to do it when I was coming home from work, so people would think I was tired, because I even had shame. I didn't want people to think that I ended my life, because I was embarrassed about even that, right? But I would go to work and be totally fine, and I would be an effective paramedic, and I'll be totally normal on the outside. So it's really scary, and I know there's people out there like that, and that's why I do that. I share that story with other people, and that's why I do the artwork. That's why I speak about my experiences, is that I'm hoping that there's someone out there that is going through that same spot that I was, where they're in that false okay. And, they'll hear me speak, or hear some of my peers speak, or read the comments on the photos, and make them realize that, hey, it's not normal to act normally and still have a suicide plan. Like, that's not a normal thing. There's other alternatives to that. But because the PTSD changes your brain chemistry, you lose the capacity to know how much trouble you're in. You lose the capacity to know that even help is in front of you. There's another picture I did called The Thirsty Horse. I don't know if it's in that book you have.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea of that horse, in that picture, it's a picture of an emaciated horse. This horse is dying. I used demons in my artwork to represent trauma. And on the back of this horse is a demon with tattoos, with shame and guilt and embarrassment. And this horse is at a watering trough, and it says peer support on there, but that could be peer support. It could be therapy. It could be whatever your therapy is. But the demon is blinding this horse. So the horse is dying or in real life, this emergency worker has a suicide plan, but they don't even know that they're in trouble. Like they don't realize that that's not a normal process to have. They lose the capacity to realize that, hey, this isn't normal, or they lose the capacity to recognize that they're dying. Because even the people that I spoke with that are on that verge of ending their lives, they'll say, look, they don't want to die. They don't want to leave their family. They don't want to end their life. They just don't want to feel anything anymore, right? So it's not, they just can't, they no longer have the energy or the capacity to continue on. They wake up in the morning and it's just constant pressure, constant feelings of feeling bad that they have to hide, which also takes energy. And often at nighttime, it's worse because at nighttime, you don't have the consciousness to defend yourself against these feelings. So you wake up in the morning and you feel horrible. And then you have to pretend that everything is okay. And it's very exhausting. It's very exhausting. So the people that I spoke with, they're like, I don't want to end my life. I don't want to leave my family, but I just don't have the energy. I don't have the capacity I just don't want to feel anything anymore. Right. So it's really sad that happens, and it continues to happen. And sometimes they just need someone to reach in and grab them out and pull them out because it's their brain chemistry. They've lost the capacity to know that they're in trouble. That was a super long answer to a question I can't remember what you asked.
No, I again appreciate your openness so much. Yeah, I mean, I'm a little quiet here because I'm processing everything as well, right?
Yeah, it's a super heavy topic. Like it is heavy duty, right?
No, and this is why we're talking about this, right? We want people to understand this, but you talked about your end of life plan, and you're even worrying about, you have in your mind how people will respond to it. You don't want people to know necessarily that you that was the plan. You wanted it to maybe kind of look like an accident, or you were tired. And there's obviously that part of that is, I think you mentioned like guilt and shame and all of these different things. How much of that is pressure to live up to this stereotype of what a first responder, quote unquote, should be or is? You mentioned the term hero earlier. And I guess many individuals in society have this idea in their head of what a first responder is or should be, what type of person they are. They're meant to protect us and they're meant to be strong and all of these things. How heavy does that weigh on a first responder?
Probably not as much as you think. I think the larger pressure comes from your peers, right? Mm-hmm. Worrying that you're going to fail your fellow police officers or your fellow firefighters, or your fellow paramedics, or your fellow nurses, or your fellow dispatchers. I think that is a bigger worry and a bigger fear than living up to the idea of being this infallible superhero. I think maybe it used to be that way, but I think the biggest fear really is appearing weak to your peers opposed to appearing weak to the public, really.
Mm-hmm. You have a picture here as well in your third art book called The Grim Medic, which when I read through your narrative on this, I was quite surprised, which maybe I shouldn't have been. And this is why we educate ourselves, right? But can I just read the first paragraph of your narrative here? It says, your patient didn't die because you put a 20-gram IV in instead of an 18-gram. He died because he had a massive heart attack. Your patient didn't die because you couldn't stop the bleeding. He died because his body was crushed in a violent car accident. And then you talk a little bit about how there are first responders, judging one another, saying things like he or she should have done it this way, or they're gonna kill somebody one day with the way that they go about these things, the approach that they take. And when I read one of the responses to that, I was really surprised, because somebody essentially said that that we need to go tougher on each other, right? Because mediocrity has become a thing, or people don't take it as seriously. I don't know if that's the term that they use, but they don't practice excellence maybe as much as they should in their careers. And I was just it took me a few minutes to get past this page because I was like, There's so much here in terms of the interpersonal relationships with your peers. How does one even navigate those relationships, and what is the right way to approach things like this? Like if there's a first responder who maybe I don't want to use the term, but like pulling their weight, like maybe they have other things going on. Like how does that all fit together?
Yeah, that's a topic for a whole other podcast, probably.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of that picture, and I'll describe that picture. So it's a paramedic, but the paramedic looks like a Grim Reaper. So he's standing in the back of the ambulance, and people really interpreted that in their own way. And when I create the artwork, although I do have the narrative there, I don't really want to share too much what my personal motivation was for creating it, because I want people to look at it and attach their own experiences to it. If I tell them what my motivation was as the creator of the artwork, I don't want to devalue their interpretation of it. So a lot of people took that a different way, where they think, paramedics are killing people, or they're, the Grim Reaper is the medic. And, if you're not a very good paramedic, you're going to kill people. But that's not my motivation for that picture. The name tag on that paramedic says critic. And the idea was that we are our own worst critics, that we will review every call that we go on, especially if it's a halo call, which is a high acuity, low occurrence call, or like the serious calls. We'll go through every detail and be like, yeah, maybe, I should have given him 7.5 milligrams instead of 5 milligrams. And maybe that's why he died. It's like, well, no, he died because, what happened even before you got there. So we're really critical on ourselves that way. And then, when I posted that's brought a lot of conversation on my social media. There's a lot of, the pendulum is almost swinging, not in my opinion, but in some people's opinion, where, there's this, you're getting too soft, or there's, suck it up, buttercup, or, if you can't do this job anymore, then quit, that type of stuff, versus a more supportive environment where, getting back to your question, if I had a partner, if I saw someone that wasn't kind of pulling their weight, so to speak, I wouldn't immediately go to thinking, hey, you suck as a paramedic. I would start thinking, okay, what's going on in their lives that's made this change? What's happening in the background? I would approach them on it and saying, hey, what's happened? These are the things that I've noticed. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to help? Because usually there's other reasons for that type of stuff. So if there's, for emergency workers that are starting to change in their behaviors, and there's many behaviors that are known to be signs of trauma, lack of confidence is a huge one, which may result in what appears to be less effective emergency worker. So I think there's more behind the scenes than something as simple as, if you can't hack it, then you're not being excellent enough. It's a bigger picture than that, and way more complex.
Yeah. And we're talking about these different signs and behavior changes sometimes can be very indicative of something else going on. And it's possible that changes in your behavior at work, or the way that you approach different calls and situations, like you said, there could be something else going on there. And we've had a great discussion about the way that you use your art to process things. Do you think, we know the answer to this too, but people in the field don't necessarily know how to address the trauma that they've experienced, right? Are there people that you have come across that have developed another, similar to you, like a unique way of processing all of these things that you see?
Yeah, there's many treatment models that people can follow. I'm just lucky that people like my artwork. I play guitar as well, but I'm not very good. So people don't, invite me to go speak about my guitar playing, but it's still very therapeutic for me. Many people, they'll do yoga, they'll do exercise, they'll hike, they'll go hunting. There's lots of different things that they will do that kind of balance out. And the hard part is finding that one thing that really helps for you.
Right.
There's different treatment modalities that really may work for some people, not for others. Cognitive behavior therapy may be great for a lot of people, but it may not be good for other people. So there's many different options that people just need to find what works for them. But 100%, I always recommend people, when they're starting off, to get assessed by a professional mental therapist. either a psychologist, psychiatrist, or someone that is trained to recognize those things so that they can find out what's happening. And then that therapist can help them find that treatment modality that works best for them. Right. So and that's not always that's not always easy. And, there's a lot of politics with, mental health treatment as well, where people would say, their treatment models are the only way. The other ones just don't work. So it's sad to see that, but the hard part is just finding out what works best for you.
Yeah, and I think that applies to everyone who is trying to address some sort of mental health challenge that they're experiencing. I think it's really difficult when somebody who's experiencing something kind of finds it within themselves to start on the journey of healing and therapy, and they maybe try something and it doesn't work out super well for them, and then that's really discouraging, right? So I think almost there's a need to normalize the fact that like sometimes it doesn't help right away necessarily. The idea of kind of putting your eggs in one basket when you walk into that therapy room for the first time, sometimes it doesn't turn out the way that you expect it to, or you don't feel super great afterwards, but it's not necessarily going to look like a upward linear trajectory, right? You might try, you have in your mind, you mentioned guitar, right? So maybe there's somebody who thinks to themselves, I'm going to try and play guitar and I'm going to get a lot out of this and I'm going to release so many emotions, and they don't feel great after it necessarily, but that doesn't mean you stop, right? There are so many different ways and things that you can try to release some of this energy and process some of your emotions, but it can take effort to keep going. But that's something that we have to remember going in, I think.
Yeah. And if you're at that space, you've already won, really. If you've already recognized the fact that you need some type of help and you're asking for it, then you're 80% of the way there. A, you've recognized that there's a problem, and two, you've have the courage to get help. Often, even when you recognize that there's something wrong, you just hope that tomorrow's going to be a better day. And that can go on for years, where you just hope that, okay, I'm just sad today. I'm not feeling good today. And you just hope that things will go away on their own. That's what we all do. So if you're seeking therapy and seeking for ways to get better, then you're already well on your way to recovery.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned one of the things earlier that sometimes people do is yoga. Can you tell me a little bit about the trauma-focused yoga initiative that your wife and yourself have tag teamed on?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'd say we tag teamed on it. I don't. That's kind of, yoga's her thing, and I certainly should be doing more yoga than I do. But yeah, Roxanne's wonderful. So she is like the perfect yoga. She did her yoga training in Thailand, and she's super earthy. She's the definition of a tree hugger. She's beautiful. She's wonderful. She's super, super bendy. And yeah, she's great. So she's taken specialized training in trauma, yoga for trauma. So often when we travel, for example, when we were in Finland a couple of years ago for a conference I was speaking at, she did a yoga class for trauma prior to the sessions that started. We did the same thing at the EMS Today conference. So she travels with me and offers to do yoga sessions as part of these conferences, these yoga for trauma for emergency workers, which has been very successful. She's done very well with that.
Yeah, no, that's great. Another way to a little bit of a release, right? Finding the thing that works for you. And I'm sure that works for a lot of people.
And yoga works for a lot of people. It's mindfulness, it's breathing, it's focusing on another part of your mind apart from your trauma and identifying with your trauma or identifying with your profession. Mm-hmm. It's quite a bit different. So a lot of people really use that to connect and part of the therapy. It's not for everybody, but it is for many people. Yeah,
I'm thinking about how you've said this before, and just how big of a part of your life your profession and your traumas become. Like there's this whole other part of you, many other parts of you that as a first responder probably is really difficult to tap into when this is what you're doing for 24 hours straight. And even if you have a day in between, like how do you just turn that off and go and do your other things? I don't think we're trying to turn it off, but you want to get to a point where you're processing it enough that you can engage with the other parts of yourself and your life, right?
Yeah, and that's for emergency workers. often they are what they do. You are a firefighter, you are a paramedic, you are a police officer, and that remains when you go home. And if that's not causing any problems, then that's wonderful to have that much pride in your work. But for me, part of my healing process is that I needed to release myself from that. So when I'm at home, I'm not a paramedic or a firefighter. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm an artist. I focus on other things. When I go back to work, then I'm a paramedic again. I don't identify. And I had to do that for myself as part of my recovery. I'm not saying that everyone should do that, but I needed to limit my stressors. And that was one of the ways that I did that, was change who I identify with. It's all about perspective, really. I have a whole other thing on perspective. And because that was a big part of my healing process. And so my perspectives had to change on who I was, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you're talking about, when you do go back to work, you come home and you're the other part of yourself, and then you go back to work and you do what you need to do. And I mean, I'm sure this varies, but how much support or encouragement is there in the workplace to help people process and heal from on-the-job trauma?
Again, that could be a whole other podcast interview. It's definitely better now than it was. I think people are recognizing the benefits of being supportive financially, right? And it's just the right thing to do. So I think there's more support than there was. Now, and again, this is my own opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else apart from myself, but in my experiences from what I've seen in my travels and the thousands of people that I've spoken to that are my peers, many organizations say that they support mental health. They have all these initiatives and they're very verbal on what they're doing to support the mental health, but often that doesn't get down to the ground level. Or when push comes to shove, there's not a whole lot of mental health for the people that actually need it, unfortunately. Now, I have been to some places where it's wonderful. And when I do travel, for example, when I was in Australia, in Melbourne, Victoria Ambulance Service is a huge ambulance service. And I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of paramedics there. I spoke to the union leaders. I spoke to the CEOs and the psychologists there. And that's one place where everything did match up, right? So what I was hearing from at the top, what they were doing, did actually match up to the paramedic that works the street. So I think in Australia, they're ahead of us, I think, for mental health support, saying what they're doing and actually doing and being effective, measuring what they're doing, and it actually being effective to the people that need it, to the frontline men and women that need it. Here in North America, a lot of places say that they're doing, and it's still fairly new, right? So there's still a lot of work to do, and a lot of times I don't think we're still trying to navigate our way through this. And I think overall we are getting better, but there's still a long ways to go. I think where what we say we're going to do actually happens with what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it's nice to know that there are models out there that work for certain countries or for certain areas. Are there efforts to learn from those countries or those models and to see how we can almost infuse what works for them into what is happening here? Yeah,
there is. And I don't mean to imply that people don't want to help, like organizations that do have these plans. It's difficult to process or to navigate that and to get it to the people that need it. Mental health is not black and white. It's not like physical injuries where, you break your leg, it's very measurable. With mental health, it's difficult. It's very gray. So it's people, I think, are doing the best that they can. So I don't want to say that people are neglecting what they're trying to do. We have a little ways to go. I see a lot of different organizations do a lot of wonderful things. One of the presentations I do is I share what I've learned through traveling and learning about what other departments are doing in their mental health supports for their workers. And I kind of narrowed it down to three things. Most departments now have a peer support aspect. So kind of, I call it the mental health seatbelt, right? So there's preventative measures like education and training for supervisors and workers and about mental health. And, these are signs and symptoms. If this starts to come up, this is what you do. And, R2MR or resilient minds for firefighters, lots of different programs coming up for that, which is preventative. And then there's the critical incident stress management, which has been a model that Dr. Jeff Mitchell started, I think, way back in the 90s, which is something that almost all departments follow. And that's kind of when shit hits the fan kind of thing. When you have that bad call, how do you manage that critical incident? Most departments follow that model. But few departments, and this is something that's up and coming, is reintegration. Normally for reintegration, if you went to that critical call and then you had to be off work for a couple of days or even longer, reintegration involved, okay, well, you're going to shadow, if there was any reintegration, like, okay, you're going to shadow shift your crew for a day and then you're going to go back to work 100%. But that reintegration phase is really critical, and that could really mean the difference between long-term disability and recovery. If you start talking about sanctuary trauma, perceived injustice, all these other things that can happen during that phase, that's a really critical phase. And there's some research being done on that. Here in Edmonton, actually, we're Glenn Close at Edmonton Police Services, he's developed an integration program that he gets invited to share around the world, including Australia. So the reintegration portion is new and up and coming, I think, really critical. And it's more of a robust segment of the whole system than it is right now for most departments. But I did recognize and notice that some departments had a really good reintegration program. But I've never been to a service, or I don't know of any services that have a really good peer support program, a really good CISM program, and a really good reintegration model that incorporate all three of those things. So I think if we can incorporate aspects of, and people are doing it, like this isn't things that I've made up. These are things that I've seen other departments do. And it would be great if someone just kind of copied what all these other departments are doing and kind of integrated them all. We're trying to do that in my own department. I work for the City of Leduc, so my chief he's trying, but again, it's really difficult. It's not an easy thing to do effectively, but at least the initiative is there to start. And then, you can work out the bugs as you go to eventually have something better than we did before.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, every department has its own, I guess, needs. Like there's no blanket solution to this necessarily.
No.
Mental health is so complex, and then each department has its own needs. So I guess you need kind of that representation at all of the different levels. You need that encouragement and someone to step forward in all of those different areas.
Yeah, it's not. I think there should be more effort and more priority put on mental health, as far as business models go for not only the emergency workers, but for any organization. I think that will come. But more and more research is being done. We're learning more and more every day, and I think we are getting better at it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's like we said, it's complicated, but it's good to know that we're moving in the right direction, right? So, that's great. I was wondering too, like, are first responders, maybe here and other places, how often are they encouraged to try therapy or to reach out and find some psychological services?
Well, again, that depends on what service you're going to. Stigma is a real thing. And in some departments, if you come forward, you'll be fired.
Yeah.
Right. Or you will, if you share what you're feeling, or if you come forward saying, hey, that last call really kind of messed me up, you're going to have negative reactions to that. And that's a real thing. So when I first started getting recognition in my R work, that's one of the things I really tried to promote, smash the stigma. And I would tell people, hey, come forward and say something. But then I would get messages, hey, Dan, I came forward and said something, now I got fired, or I got blackballed, or I got, kicked out of our officer development program, or, all these negative things started to happen. And that is a real thing that does happen. So I understand how people would not want to come forward, but that's okay. If you don't feel that you are in a safe environment or a supportive environment to get the help that you need that way, maybe your employer isn't the best source for your mental health recovery. And there's lots of other, like your organization, like Shift Psychology and other programs out there that can help you where your employer doesn't even need to know. there's lots of online mental health assessment tools that you can take depending on where you are. They'll give you suggestions or ideas of what you can do outside of your department if you're in the unfortunate situation where you don't feel safe enough or supportive enough to ask for help in your department. And there are lots of departments that say, yes, we support mental health. We want to support our people's, and those departments, I've heard from people in there where they've come forward and they've been fired. So it's, you hear one thing, but the reality is something different, right?
Yeah. Like this is a very systemic issue, clearly.
Oh, yeah.
It's just, I mean, we've been talking about some of these things as we have prepared for this podcast, and we're working on the presentation that I'd mentioned earlier. But just even, I don't know if many people know that that's a thing, that like the fact that first responders aren't that supported sometimes in their work environment, that if they do come forward, they're worried for their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so that takes a little bit to process too. I mean, what can we do as people who are not first responders to, I don't know, help make that change or make that switch? Or I know that there's stigma around it. That's part of the issue, but what can we do as people who are not first responders?
First, I don't want to say that that's the norm. It's not the norm that people aren't supported, right? I've know of many organizations that truly, really do support their workers. So I don't want people to think that that's what I feel is the norm, because it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, that negative stigma is a real thing that's out there. For how you can help emergency workers, I guess, I really don't know. Apart from supporting them, and I think what's really might have to change to get things to really change in our favor is through legislation. So doing it through politics. For example, there's some places where if a firefighter takes his life, that organization is investigated, just like a physical injury, where the organization needs to show that they've done their best to prevent that. For, let's say example, so if a firefighter in my department took his own life, if there was legislation where that was investigated, right, and you needed to show that you supported the mental health through measurable means to support that worker, and if you didn't, then you were liable. Right. And that happens in other parts of the world. So if that was happening, so even if you're an organization who really doesn't care about your employees, then you're going to have to do it. Otherwise, it's going to cost you money. Right. So that's through legislation, I think, if that can change. So if people can push that agenda or make that happen, that would be great. Another way to support emergency workers is, healthcare, mental health, but like psychology and treatment is very expensive. I'm lucky I have a program, I have benefits for that, but many, volunteer paramedics or firefighters don't have that. And I'm talking throughout the United States and the world. We don't have volunteer paramedics in Alberta that I know of. But, often the benefit plan will cover 3 sessions, and that's barely enough to get started. Right. So it'd be great if we could push some type of mental health support program for emergency workers that didn't cost us anything. Mm-hmm. Right. That would be, and I know that's something that you guys are working on. So anything I can do to help support you guys at that's great.
Yeah.
So that's something that would be very, very supportive for us. I know a lot of people struggle with that because they don't get the help that they need because they can't afford it. Mm-hmm. Right. And then, just be really supportive of your emergency workers and just understand what they're doing, what they're going through.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that we can do, is hearing from people like you about what you've experienced and what you are doing to cope with many of the things that you're experiencing, just learning, right? So that helps us to, change our mindsets if that's what's necessary. The way that we see things, the way that we understand the world is not always what you think it is. There are always things that you don't see. You call 911, you expect people to be there right away, but who's on the other side, right? What have they experienced? Just being aware, I think, is something that is really important in any subject, really, right? So I think and I hope that people will learn something from what we've talked about today. And so I wanted to thank you, Daniel, for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
And I know it's a really heavy topic.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I do these interviews, it's like you end it off with like, oh man, that's so heavy. Why do you want to even continue doing that job if if you become suicidal from it? So, I want to say that, being an emergency worker is a very honorable profession. We are in the position to really make a difference in someone's lives. Like it is an amazing, I don't want to discourage anyone from becoming an emergency worker. Again, almost 20 years I've been doing this, and every day I go to work and I see things that I've never seen before. So it didn't disappoint. Like that's why I wanted to get into it. I wanted to live my life to the fullest and see what was out there. And I see what's out there. Like I really see things that most people don't. And that's why I do it. And I feel that's an honor to be in those circumstances with people that, you can make a difference in their life. And if not, then be with them when they leave this world. That's the biggest show there is. That's the biggest show on earth. Mm-hmm. So although, when we talk about mental health and, that's a part of what we do, but it's not, if that was the majority of it, there wouldn't be any emergency workers.
Right. Of course. Yeah. And, it's funny. I'm lucky in my life that I've not really needed to access very many emergency services at all. The one time I did, I dislocated my knee a couple of years ago, and it wasn't fun. I was home alone, and I called 911, and the paramedics came. And I mean, I don't know if I had any expectations or anything. You're in a lot of pain, so you're not really thinking about it. But I was like delirious after they started giving me like some medication and stuff, but they were just so lovely to me. There were two of them who came, and one even went to get me I was wearing shorts at the time, and they went to get me like a pair of pants because they knew it would be like a little bit colder after. And they asked me where to look for that. And they asked me, what else are you going to need at the hospital? Like, where's your phone? And I was probably saying all sorts of crazy stuff. And
they took the pain away for you or lessened it, I imagine, right? Yeah.
Yeah. They also become your best friend when they give you the drugs, right?
Yeah.
So, that reminds me of one of the photos that I saw in your book where you talked about a 4 a.m. call and how sometimes you might dread that. Like you don't want to be woken up or it's the middle of the night, but the way that you said it, even if you're going to help an elderly person who is having some pain, you said that the reason that they're calling at that time in the night is because they probably woke up from it, or the pain is enough for them to call. And you said to even just be with somebody for something like that, you're doing something for someone. And it also means that you're not there while someone is maybe at the end of their life, and you'd rather be there with somebody who's in some pain. And that they're going to be okay, but you're even there for those moments. And I think that is just, I think everyone who receives your services, we're so appreciative of that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Like I'd much prefer going to you and taking away your knee pain, taking you to the hospital, than going to, a murder suicide or going to a traumatic car accident where a family's been killed. Right. So we never really know what we're going to go to. So for those paramedics, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but if it was me, if the tones went off, first we're thinking, oh my God, what is it? Hopefully it's nothing. The weird thing is sometimes we'll call those the good calls, actually, depending, I guess, where you are in your career. And I guess some people would prefer, again, I'm only speaking on behalf of myself, but I would be happy to come to you and fix your knee, knowing that, now I'm not going to have to go to that other call where might be the motivation for my next art piece.
Right. Yeah. Well, Daniel, thank you again. I wanted to mention that you can take a look, all the listeners out there, take a look at Daniel's art books. You can find them at dansunphotos.com. I have here dansungallery.com as well. Is that another place people can go?
Yeah, there's a link to both. So probably the better one is dansunphotos.com.
Sure.
That kind of has all my images and a lot of the write-ups and links to other parts to my books and stuff. And the DanSun Gallery is specific, just the art pieces.
Okay. We have your Facebook here as well, DanSun Photos. Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn are DanSun Photo Art, and we'll make sure to put that in our description. You know where to find us here at Shift as well. And our presentation on first responder trauma and PTSD is available on our website and social media. Any last minute things, Daniel, you wanted to add?
No, that was great.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again for being here, Daniel.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Sounds great.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Shift Show. Be sure to check out our website, shiftpsych.com, for more great content to help you optimize your life. Follow us on social media at ShiftPsych, and let us know if you have ideas or things you'd really like to hear about on the podcast. If you found this useful or interesting, which you probably did since you're still here, please share and review the show. And make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This lets us know that you like what you hear so we can bring you more of it. The podcast was brought to you by Shift Psych's results-driven mind trainers. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Shift Show.